Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Kris Newby, who is an award-winning science writer, senior producer of the Lyme disease documentary Under Our Skin, and the award-winning author of BITTEN, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons, which I'm just about to finish reading. You can see it on my Kindle. I highly recommend it. And welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Kris.
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation. I really have listened to a few of your episodes. I find them really interesting. Good choice of topics, too.
Yeah, biological warfare, germ warfare, fun times. And, I'm always interested in exploring this topic. I've got guests on from time to time to cover it. I've had Jeffrey Kay, who's been looking into germ warfare in the 1950s. And I did interview the Bioweapons Act author, Francis Boyle, back in January of 2020. The first to get his thought on coronavirus, and that interview went viral, 300,000 views, and they took it down, and so on and so forth. But maybe we could start with your book, BITTEN. We can't do it justice in the short time that we have, which is why I recommend people get it and read it. And maybe if you could tell us about the book, Lyme disease, what you discovered, how it's basically biological warfare, and how the government's got all these secret projects, they're deceiving us. And actually, my former pastor in Mexico got Lyme disease recently, and it was a very debilitating kind of Lyme disease. And so, where to start?
Well, I started out in 2002 as a tech writer, and then my family went to Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts for a vacation, and we came back to California, and my husband and I got really, really sick with some unknown disease. It took the California medical system a year, 10 doctors, $60,000 to finally get diagnosed with two tick-borne diseases. It's Lyme disease and babesiosis, which is a malaria-like disease, red blood cell infection. So that was my first eye-opening experience with the U.S. medical system, which works great for well checks, but when you have a mysterious chronic disease, everything falls apart. And I think people listening to this, my hope is that we can learn from the mistakes that were done with Lyme disease, especially with this even bigger problem, which is chronic COVID, long COVID. So after I found the right doctor who had a lot of experience in tick-borne diseases, I was well enough in a year to start a documentary, which is called Under Our Skin. You can still watch it if you have free for Amazon Prime. And it really, I went from tech writing to the deep dive in medical science writing, because I had so many questions about why this disease was so broken. And I teamed up with a great documentarian, Andy Wilson in Marin. And together we went on this journey, 3.5 years, filming people all over the nation who have chronic Lyme. And I was the researcher, investigator, and really took the deep dive on why our medical system is broken, the profit incentives, the influence of pharma and insurance companies in denying care to these people who are truly sick. And the movie still watched widely because there are 500,000 new Lyme disease cases a year. It's a built-in audience, unfortunately. And I have to say, after 40 years since this disease was discovered, it was for the causative agent, same year as HIV/AIDS, the causative agent was discovered. Not much has gotten better, has improved for patients on the ground. We still have no accurate testing that works in the first month, and afterwards it's no better than a coin flip. We have a 30% failure rate for treatment. Refusal to acknowledge the chronic form of Lyme disease, which I think a lot of COVID people are finding, and a relentless rise of cases. So anyways, I launched the film, and it was an Oscar semifinalist, which is pretty amazing for a disease film, for someone to sit for an hour and a half and watch this downer picture. And after that, I told my husband, okay, I'm better now from Lyme. I've given my pound of flesh for the Lyme cause. I'm moving on, and I got a really great job as a science writer at Stanford University. But then a couple things happened, and I just couldn't walk away from the story. And the first one was that a filmmaker friend of mine interviewed Willy Burgdofer, who was the Swiss-German-American discoverer of the Lyme disease organism, who worked for 30 plus years for the NIH in Hamilton, Montana. He's the lead tick researcher in the US, celebrated for discovering Lyme disease. And he admitted to this filmmaker that he worked in the biological weapons program for years when he first came to America. So that was pretty shocking. And then the second thing is I ended up in a random family party in Texas, and I ran across a guy who used to work for his whole career as a dark ops CIA operative. And he was into his cops and regaled us with many stories of the horrible things he did in Vietnam. But at the end of this jaw-dropping dossier, list of things he did, he said, the strangest thing I ever did was drop boxes of infected ticks on Cuban sugarcane workers in the 60s. So he had no idea who I was. And I kept on running to the bathroom to take notes because I knew this was like jaw-dropping. It was the first proof that we had done, hard proof that we had done bug-borne weapons, use them on foreign soil. So anyways, at that point, I said, well, I have this full-time job, really great as a science writer, but I was in the middle of Stanford. I had a lot of resources I could call on. And I said, I have to follow this story to the end. And so that started the research for my book, BITTEN, which took 5 years all in all. And so it's been doing pretty well, but it's a lot like the lab leak theories. It was met with derision in the beginning. I was labeled as a conspiracy theorist. I don't think I got any major media reviews of the book, even though it's won 3 international book awards. It got a starred Kirkus review, which is the people that review new books that come out, and to get a starred review is really good. So that's how the book started.
A message from our sponsors. It seems we may be headed for the 1930s all over again. Financial collapse, tyranny, and world war. I've already secured multiple passports, offshore accounts, safe havens, and escaped to the sunnier shores of Mexico. My friend Mikkel Thorup of the Expat Money Show is hosting the Expat Money Summit with 30-plus experts that'll help you reclaim freedom in this fourth turning by moving your life and wealth offshore. Protect yourself and secure a new life abroad. Register now for free at expatmoneysummit.com, or don't, and enjoy surviving on insect protein while stuck in the metaverse. Since 2020, Ron Unz of Unz.com has argued the COVID outbreak was due to a U.S. biowarfare attack against China and Iran. Jeffrey Sachs, the Russian Ministry of Defense, and others are now making similar suggestions. Weeks before COVID appeared in Wuhan, a top U.S. biowarfare official ran the Crimson Contagion exercise on how to protect America against infection if a dangerous virus suddenly appeared in China. After COVID appeared in Wuhan, it jumped to Iran, infecting Iranian leadership only weeks after America had assassinated Iran's military commander. Iran publicly accused America of an illegal biowarfare attack and filed a complaint with the UN. Ron Unz has produced a free ebook and is available for interviews to further discuss this issue. And don't forget to fund Geopolitics and Empire. You can leave a donation, except on Patreon or PayPal, which have banned us, book a consultation, or become a member.
This is a very touchy subject. I remember I've interviewed Dr. Boyle over the years, and he said when he started talking about this in 2001 and anthrax, which you briefly mentioned in your book as well, that he's been blacklisted by the mainstream media. So just as you're saying now, we're really getting into a field that's very sensitive for the powers that be, for the defense industrial complex. And then maybe if we could then look into that, the bioweapons aspect, you talk about, basically to get you to tell us, how you see this biological weapons industrial complex. There's Fort Detrick. You've got Plum Island, which you mentioned in your book, which I think is defunct, but I read earlier this year they're building new facilities, more than one in the U.S. So I think one massive one in the Midwest, maybe somewhere in Kansas, and then like another one which is meant to replace Plum Island. And so, your further thoughts on bio warfare?
Yeah, so it started after World War II. The Russians and us split up the German scientists. We took we were the ones who interrogated the Japanese scientists. And what we found out is there was this pretty large biological weapons thing going on in those countries. Germany supposedly never deployed them. Japan definitely did. And so after that, the U.S. really said, well, we have to up our game on biological weapons. And this is the same time the nuclear program, the Manhattan Project, started ramping up. So I would say the biological weapons program was almost as big as Manhattan and certainly had the same secrecy rules and protocols in place. And through my research, I realized that the bug-borne weapons program was much larger and more secretive than anybody had realized. And I've spoken a lot with Jeffrey Kay, and it's great to talk to him because his obsession is the Korean War, the use of biological weapons in the Korean War, which lots of circumstantial evidence, and he's trying to get the proof because so many of these documents were destroyed and this whole disinformation system kicked into place. And then we have a slight overlap because I started my research in 1951, which is the Cold War bug-borne weapons program. So there's a lot of overlap there. And then the main character in my book, Willy Burgdofer, who was really a key player in the bug-borne weapons program, was hired to help refine the insect delivery methods for the Korean War, then the Vietnam War. So, and we don't have proof on use in the Vietnam War, just anecdotal proof on the Vietnam War. But when I first really sat down with Willy Burgdofer after the Cuban tick confession, I mean, the stuff he said was just so shocking. His first job when he came from Switzerland, the Swiss Tropical Institute, was to put plague and fleas. So you could drop the fleas on your enemy, and that would cause mass casualties. Then there was a particularly virulent form of yellow fever in Trinidad, and they brought that over, and then he tried to figure out ways to put it in mosquitoes. And then his specialty was ticks. He'd worked with soft body ticks from Africa when he was in Switzerland. And so in Africa, it's mostly relapsing fever, which is a little spirochete. Lyme disease is also a spirochete, and it's mostly in hard ticks, deer ticks, black-leg ticks. So his assignment, he was a contractor working for the Public Health Service, which then became NIH. And his contracts, he would take, and he worked at Fort Detrick, that's the head of the Chemical and Biological Weapons Program, periodically in Maryland, and then also Rocky Mountain. So his job was to take an assignment from Fort Detrick. Okay, we want a chronically incapacitating disease that can be put into a bug. So he would take, there was one experiment where he would put Venezuelan equine encephalitis inside of ticks, rabies, yellow fever, just to see what would stick. So it's really accelerating nature. In nature, there's just like in a given area, there's one tick where one disease works well with, is symbiotic with it. It doesn't kill the tick. It can pass its genes on. And it doesn't kill too many people because evolution has made sort of a balance. But when you put strange diseases and strange ticks and drop them in foreign countries, it can wreak a lot of havoc. So that was the shocking interview that really launched the book. But then I hit a wall because I realized most of those documents were destroyed from 1969 to 72. when the biological weapons program ended. But the government, a bureaucracy, always keeps copies here and there, finance documents. And in this case, Willy Burgdofer had saved copies in his secret little garage. So as he got to the end of his life, he felt remorse, I guess, for the things he did. And he released the documents to an adjunct professor at BYU in Utah and said, I want these saved for posterity, put into an archive. So that professor, I knew that professor, and he knew I was working on Willy's biography. And he said, would you like to look at them? So that was sort of a breakthrough. The book never would have been there without really backups of Detrick reports, lab notes, letters. So I could really put together the arc of his life of how he was an ambitious young scientist researcher, wanted to do good, save lives from tropical medicine. And then all of a sudden he finds himself in the middle of this biological weapons program. And I think it's a lot like joining the CIA or the mafia. Everything's secret. And once you're there, you can't leave. Hotel California, you can check in, but you can never leave, especially with a scientist, because what is he going to do? He can't publish about putting plague in fleas and how great that was. So
yeah,
stuck.
It's interesting. You mentioned Jeff Kay. I just talked to him last night. I have my live TNT radio program, and so he was my guest last night. He had just published his latest Medium blog post on what we've been talking about. So, I mean, basically, it seems then what they did was you just mentioned it. They were putting stuff into the ticks, and then once that gets into nature, you can't close that Pandora's box. No, I mean, like that's it. That's out in nature. That's probably one reason they want to keep quiet, because they'd be responsible for that. And I guess there's no way now I mean, it's just out there. And you said people are getting sick every year, 500,000 people or so, and there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. No.
Right. And climate change is making it worse because, well, there's two issues with the tick-borne diseases. One is they were trying to weaponize this Lone Star tick, which in the 13 colonies up in the Northeast, before there was a deer tick, pretty much just sits around and sits on a blade of grass and waits for a mammal to go by. But Lone Stars were much more hardy and aggressive. They have primitive eye buds, so they stalk their prey and swarm, in addition to sensing CO2. And then they carry a couple bad diseases that the deer tick didn't. And one is Rocky-Mountain spotted fever, which is the most deadly tick-borne bacteria. And then also their saliva is inducing this red meat allergy. So in some people, you get bitten by a Lone Star and you can never enjoy a hamburger or a T-bone steak again, or otherwise you get anaphylactic shock or a rash or some severe allergic reaction. So anyways, the military in their wisdom said, this is a great tick. It can survive any winter. It's very aggressive. We can put diseases in these ticks and release them in Ukraine or Russia or wherever. There's no proof of that yet, that's happened. And it'll weaken the population, and then we'll go in with ground forces or bombs, and it'll be easier to take care of. And the Russians were doing the same. It was just a bug-borne weapons escalation. So let's see. Oh, so the freakiest experiment I learned about it. So they wanted to figure out how to mass produce these ticks, and Willy helped with that. And then they had a researcher at Old Dominion University who was very ambitious, and he was running the tick-borne diseases. So he got Lone Stars, he mass produced them, he made them radioactive, and then he released them in a large field that was divided into 1 meter grids. And then he would go back between 1967 to 1969, and the ticks were radioactive, so he could track how far they'd gone with a Geiger counter. So he would see how far they'd gone, then put them back in the grid where he collected them and wait for a few more months. So the problem with that is uncontrolled, pretty much non-native tick for that area. He was releasing hundreds of thousands of them, and the numbers are in my book. And then that coastal Virginia town where he did the experiments is on the Atlantic bird flyway. So those birds go from South America to the Caribbean, up along the East Coast, and then up Great Lakes, Canada. And a bird can go from Virginia to Long Island in like 5 days. He measured that, so he knows that. And all of a sudden, this Lone Star tick became established in Long Island around the late 60s, and 2 years after his experiments, and there were unusual outbreaks of deadly spotted fever on Long Island. So my book starts with, I looked at, recent history says, Lyme disease started 1981 when Willy discovered the Lyme disease bacterium. And I go, I started looking at the backstory, because it's never just one discovery. Like, there was a slow burn. And what I discovered is there were 3 nasty tick-borne diseases that all of a sudden happened in that New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey area. This crazy Lyme disease that was supposedly new, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, a version of it, and babesiosis, which is a cattle parasite, and it was second time in man in that area. So you look at an outbreak like that, all tick-borne diseases, it's just unusual. It's not what would happen in nature. So what I do in the book is talk about the backstory and how unusual it is. And then it sets it up for Willy Burgdofer finally telling me, and the other filmmaker, and it's on video. I think that the discovery, there was something else besides Lyme disease that was making people sick. And that was a bacterium closely related to Rocky Mountain spotted fever called a rickettsia. It's well documented that the military was developing rickettsias in large vats, aerosolizing them so they could spray it over large quantities. They did that with anthrax and Q fever, tularemia, which is another tick-borne disease. So I don't know that Willy said accidents happened, which was very ambiguous. So I end the book with a lot of theories on what could have happened, but I think there's pretty strong evidence that it was an unnatural event. Call it a tick lab leak if you want. And so I think as we face this COVID lab leak theory, it helps to know what happened in the past and how the military dealt with it, and how they become really good at cover-ups, and maybe the new wave of journalists can use that to understand what happened with COVID.
Yeah, maybe we could look at that. And as well, you seem to touch on in your book DNA-specific bioweapons. You write, quote, weapons designers were looking for a tick that wouldn't arouse the suspicion of an enemy country filled with an agent for which the target enemy population wouldn't have natural immunity. That is sort of like DNA specific, because this group of people don't have the immunity. And in the COVID era, the last 2 years, maybe we can transition to your view on what's been going on the last 2 years. We've got Jeffrey Sachs coming out, the Russian Ministry of Defense positing the theory that this was a U.S. biowarfare agent, whether it's a leak or intentional. As well, Dr. Boyle says, I'd agree with him. I mean, they were working with the Chinese as well. I mean, because they were outsourcing the stuff, to African labs, to Wuhan. Doing all of this stuff in general, like the U.S. outsources it to countries where it's not illegal, because doing it within the U.S. is supposed to be illegal. So that's why I think they outsource it. And many countries are doing this, right? The Russians, as you said, do this. The Chinese and maybe a few other countries. I think Britain, Israel, maybe France or someone. But yeah, your thoughts on the whole Corona episode, because there was all this censorship in the beginning, But now I can't see it as natural. It just, for me, it just seems like the natural version just doesn't cut it. But I mean, your thoughts here.
Yeah. So upfront, I'll say I'm not an expert on COVID. I'm specializing in one lab lake, which is the ticks and tick-borne diseases. But there are some commonalities. And at Stanford, I was a science writer in the clinical trials group. So I know that we have a certain layer of safety in conducting clinical trials here in the US. And it's because of that, it's very expensive to do clinical trials. And we have a lot of ethical oversight. So a lot of ambitious researchers will move these sketchy experiments overseas to save money and be able to go up to the bleeding edge. So, I mean, from what I've heard about COVID, some of that gain of function research for bat viruses started in North Carolina with some Chinese fellowship students. They went over to Wuhan. They carried on those experiments. And the viruses that they're working on were pretty close to what we see as COVID. But, I haven't done the deep dive on that. So there are people like Jeffrey Sachs who are more informed on that. But I know that I see the government using the same playbook for cover-ups when they suspect an accident has happened. And definitely NIH funded some of that preliminary research. That's pretty well documented too. But first of all, there's a flat denial. They convince the media to bury the story. And then there's censorship and shaming of the journalists who dare to ask questions. And I feel pretty strong. I have an engineering background and I worked at Stanford Medical School for 10 years. In order for science to advance, people have to be able to ask questions and debate things. And anytime there's a scientific discovery, you need to throw it out there and let people put darts at it. And that's how science evolves. And if the government is censoring the basic information we have about a new outbreak, then we're going to be building an edifice of science on a bad foundation, and it's going to hurt people. And I think that's what I see with Lyme disease that makes me so angry, is that if in the beginning we had known that it wasn't just the Lyme disease bacterium that was making people sick, there were these other organisms in the ticks that makes it complex to diagnose and treat. But also the people involved, there was a lot of hubris. The scientists, they wanted to claim that they had, and the politicians, they wanted to claim that they had solved this epidemic and that just simple antibiotics would cure it 2 weeks or whatever. And that epidemic is one and done. And we see that with COVID too. It's like we've stopped tracking it. There's a lot of pressure not to look under the hood on the origin of it. And ultimately, I just think that harms the sufferers.
Yeah, you sent me an article, I think, from 2019. So 3 years ago, the Washington Post did, I think, fact checking you, and you sort of highlighted responses. And I mean, I'm with you. It's obvious, I had in July of 2020 an Associated Press journalist reach out to me wanting to interview me about my interview with Boyle. And it was just really strange. She wanted to know all about me. And I'm like, what do I have to do with this interview with Boyle discussing Corona? It's about the topic. It has nothing to do with me. But then you kind of figure it's ad hominem character assassination. And I never responded to the guy. And I could see the article that came out, which didn't mention me because I didn't give the interview. It was a, conspiracy theorist type hit piece. And so I just feel like, good things are, that old adage, good things are done openly, and, evil or, corrupt things are done in the darknesses, as you say. Whenever there's censorship, that just brings more questions. And so, any further thoughts on, the criticism you've gotten, this Washington Post piece, which it's owned by Jeff Bezos, which works closely with the Pentagon and the military industrial complex. And so, any further thoughts on the censorship that we've been seeing?
Yeah, I find it I found it to be very frustrating because I tried to be very factual in my book and say what we know, what we don't know, where scientists need to be looking to solve this mystery. And oh, by the way, government, we really, really need to release these documents. Normally, there would be an automatic declassification. The biological weapons program has been canceled. So, just release them. But instead, FOIA after FOIA is they deny them, or they come back redacted, or they just, what's most common is just you never get the responses. It just keeps getting put at the bottom of the pile. So now, what was the original question? I started getting upset about FOIAs. It was, the Washington Post editorial. So what happened is my book came out in May 2019. It was a complete surprise to me that Congressman Kris Smith from New Jersey, which is a place that has a huge Lyme problem, he waved it up in front of C-SPAN and said, there's some credible information in this book. It's well documented. We need to help declassify and investigate the bug-borne weapons program. Because like you say, Jeffrey says, you release these bugs and there's no taking them back. Nature always wins. It's Pandora's box. And so he's introduced it to the DOD, the investigation to the DOD budget 3 times in a row, and it's been rejected every time. But right after that, the book became an international news phenom because it just sounds like such a crazy thing. We're putting disease in bugs. No way. And it fit in with the conspiracy milieu at the time. And so, but I think the government was worried, and there was a guy who works at a university, a professor, a veterinarian professor, who also studies ticks. And he wrote this about 1,000-word article. He didn't mention my book, but he linked the word conspiracy theories to my book. And it was just infuriating because I think I counted 19 lies or mistruths, well documented by other respected authors who've covered this topic. And so I called him immediately. I said, "Hey, professor, have you read my book?" And he goes, "Oh no, I don't have time to read books." And then I said, "Well, can I go over a couple things?" And I think I had 4 of the biggest lies I went over with him. And he just didn't say anything. And then I said, "Do you want me to send you a book?" "Oh no, I wouldn't read it. I'd shred it anyways," he said. So it was obvious that it just seems like he was put up by the military-industrial complex. And what he didn't disclose in the op-ed was that the professor from Tufts, and the rebuttal is on my website, www.krisnewby.com, so you can read it in detail. But he failed to disclose in the op-ed that he was the director of a new bio-level 4 research lab that is researching, for example, tick-borne tularemia, which is a select agent, which is one of the germs that the biosecurity people worry about. It's very, very deadly. So there's no oversight by the Washington Post. And currently, Washington Post has a policy where they fact check the op-eds. But I also called the science editor of the Washington Post, and they said, no, that we outsourced that to a pay-to-play journalistic organization. It's their job to fact check it, not ours. And so they violated their own policies. The author didn't disclose his conflicts. They didn't fact check it. And so I've been trying for 3 years for them to at least edit it or remove it, and they won't. So it's frustrating. And as I read historical documents, like during Vietnam, there's an oral history where one of the CIA guys involved in the Kennedy stuff said, "Oh yeah, we had journalists in our pockets in almost every media outlet, New York Times, Washington Post." So that hasn't stopped. And now it's these sort of astroturf, third-party content providers that give underfunded and overworked major media free content. It's free.
Yeah, and I mean, it just goes to show, we see Brian Stelter get all these people getting fired from mainstream media, CNN Plus failing, Chris Cuomo. I don't even watch mainstream media. I think it was on CNN, but apparently they're trying to remake these images of these former mainstream journalists I'll be blunt. I mean, for me, they're liars. They're part of the military industrial complex. They'll do whatever, they'll say whatever they're told to say. And Chris Cuomo is trying to remake himself as some edgy anti-establishment journalist, and he's going to do a podcast. And that just goes to show that a lot of us in the independent media podcasting space, we're just honestly looking for the truth. We're not afraid to be called names. We just want to know what's going on. And people are listening to us and not listening anymore to the mainstream media. So they're trying to deal with this shift. And for me, regarding Corona as well, I just kind of got suspicious when we saw all of these pandemic simulations. I don't know if this was done before, in the 20th century as often, but we see from 2001 the Dark Winter exercise, and then we've got so many in the recent years: SPARS, Crimson Contagion, Urban Outbreak, Event 201. But there were three immediately preceding 2020. There were three simulations running a coronavirus event, including China did in September 2019 in Wuhan at the airport. They simulated a coronavirus outbreak, which was just interesting. But any further thoughts on SARS-CoV-2? You had mentioned it as well. You wanted to touch on, I don't know, Roswell or other events or incidents that are important to what we've been discussing. Government cover-ups or the biodefense complex.
Yeah. So Roswell is just an example of the government's playbook of cover-ups, and it's the same thing that happened with the alien things. Then it moved on to the nerve gas accident at Dugway Proving Grounds. They refined their cover-up strategy there, and then we get to now COVID and Lyme disease. So and that the playbook, as I see it, is flat denial, convince the media to bury the story, censorship, shaming, planting this sort of half hybrid truth, so enough so it's credible, like the professor who did the op-ed, and no consequences for out and out lying. We see that a lot. And then intimidate whistleblowers, and then rewarding the cover-up participants with lucrative consulting gigs. So that's very common. But I have to say, I'm not, after going through the nitty-gritty details of the bug-borne weapons program, I don't buy into this giant conspiracy and control thing. I think we can't underestimate incompetence and accidents, because they're literally, for my area of interest, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of open-air experiments in biological weapons, and the probability of there being an accident is 100%. So if I look at like the sheep kill because of the nerve gas experiment, yeah, there was one accident, but they did 100 experiments with nerve gas the year before. And are you telling me there weren't any other breaches? They're releasing nerve gas in the air. So you can't underestimate incompetence. And the fact that the project was so large, this is the biological weapons program and the chemical, they had recruited scientists from 50 of our top universities to recruit talent, but they would only tell, they just gave them tiny little isolated problems, and they wouldn't tell them the real reason behind it. And then this is the start, right around 51 is the start of the whole concept of military industrial complex that sort of was a brainchild of Ira Baldwin, who's the bioweapons program visionary, because he realized he didn't have enough scientists to do this program. So he started going to industry too. Like, for example, General Mills, who puts Cheerios on your table every day, they helped refine the airborne biological and anti-crop stuff. So they were really good at milling grains. So we can mill bacteria and anti-crop agents, and then figure out how to spray them. They spray the sugar on the Cheerios. So I'm just saying it was so distributed, and the chances of an accident are great. So that's what I find with the biological weapons program, there was an uncontrolled release of ticks in Alaska and tularemia, spraying tularemia in Alaska, Baker Island off Hawaii. And then there's this whole class of biological weapons and assassination weapons that we can't even get to because it's buried in the CIA under MK Ultra and MK Naomi. And I just hope I get those documents before I die, naturally or unnaturally.
That'd be fascinating. But that reminds me what you're talking about as well. Mosquitoes now. We see them playing with these, Bill Gates and, the complex dealing with these GMO type mosquitoes. And that's like another Pandora's box. What effect is that going to have if they release? There's the unintended consequences of that. I don't know if you've looked into that at all.
So I had two conversations with people, scientists who I really trust. One is Manu Prakash at Stanford, and he works on low-cost solutions to nasty worldwide problems and mosquitoes. And he heard they were going to do a trial on Hawaii, and he went and said at a lecture in Hawaii and said, and the concept is you sterilize male mosquitoes genetically and then release them, and then the females mate with the sterile males, and then you cut down the population of mosquitoes that carry nasty diseases like Zika or malaria. And he said, don't do it. And then I talked to someone at CDC who followed the Brazilian trial where they did release the GMO mosquitoes. And she said, you know what? A year later, there were more of those bad mosquitoes than the year they released the sterilized ones. So the thing is, these insects have such a fast reproduction cycle, they'll always win. Like, we can change a couple genes, but the formula for mating mosquitoes is like beyond us for understanding. I think our whole strategy with fighting these diseases is balance in the ecosystem, which I'm working for a nonprofit called Invisible Internationals, where we're fighting invisible diseases. And we're doing it in the One Health framework that says, if you make a healthy environment and look at animals as sentry diseases, then you can raise the health of everything. And things seem to be in balance. So it's a new way of looking at things instead of through the eyes of pharma profits.
Yeah. And, they might end up making super mutant mosquitoes, as you said, that evolve and just make things worse. And, and it was lucky you got to meet Willy. Is it Burgdofer? I forget his last name.
Burgdofer.
Yeah, Burgdofer. I think he passed in 2015, so 7 years ago, right?
I think 2017, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so I met him during the filming of our documentary Under Our Skin. And he was retired at that time, and he had really bad Parkinson's. And he said, as an aside, he feels like that may have been caused or triggered by when he was researching Lyme disease right after the discovery. On a Sunday, he was cleaning out the rabbit cages of infected rabbits because he was going through the series of putting infected ticks on rabbits and seeing if the rabbits got the disease, and then putting clean ticks on them and see if they could transfer the disease. So since ticks didn't work on Sunday, he went and cleaned out the rabbit cages, and he feels like he got infected urine in his eye, and that's how he got Lyme disease. And he actually retired early from the NIH because of that and a few other reasons. I can't remember who was going there.
Yeah, but I thought it was also interesting. I caught in your book mention of, I don't know if it was virus or some infectious disease, and whether it was the disease or the vaccines that caused the suppression of the human immune system. And maybe that's something people are talking about, long COVID, or their adverse events with some of the COVID injections, which people are talking about again, a decline, a suppression of the human immune system regarding stuff related to COVID, which, maybe if this was, as you said, or if this is related to bioweapons research, this or, Lyme's back then, Any thoughts on this suppression of the autoimmune system? These sorts of problems that are coming about.
Yeah, I don't know about COVID, and it's hard to research it with censorship on what gets published these days. But I know Lyme disease is a badass bacteria. It has like number 1 or number 2 number of chromosomes, and it has these things called plasmids, which are circular chromosomes. It just allows it to shapeshift more. And if you look at when a Lyme spirochete goes into your body, a tick bite suppresses your immune system for about a week, so it has free reign. The spirochetes are about 4 times faster than your white blood cells that can gobble it up and protect your body. And then the Lyme bacteria has the spirochete form, which is like its super motor thing. And then it finds an immune protected site where your immune system doesn't go, in your brain or your joints with scar tissue. And it goes in when the too much immune action, it goes into a cyst form and could be dormant and your body won't see it. It also is able to shift its surface protein so your immune system can't see it. So the fact is, it's just a crafty bug. And for the mainstream medicine to say you can cure it with 2 weeks of antibiotics, it just doesn't work. And that's why it has a high failure rate. And so how can we... I just question whether this new vaccine will work, the new Lyme vaccine. I mean, I hope it works. Everybody wants a good vaccine for Lyme disease, but it may not work for the same reason we don't have an AIDS vaccine right now. The bug itself is too crafty for a simple vaccine concept.
Yeah. Is there?
I think the better strategy is to get a vaccine to prevent bites, like a flea collar. I don't know. There are a lot of really good ideas in the works that might be better, because it's not just Lyme disease. It's whatever this thing Willy was hiding. It's 28 other tick-borne diseases, and you can get bitten by a tick and get multiple of those, 2 or 3 of them, and then your immune system is overwhelmed.
It sounds like Frankenstein stuff.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Are there any other issues you wanted to bring up or get across that I haven't pulled out of the book, or that you're currently working on, or future research that you're looking into?
Well, I have action items at the end of the book, because I feel bad I couldn't wrap up the mystery like a Law and Order episode, everything in a nice tidy bow. But I wish epidemiologists, the people that study the spread of diseases, will pick up where I left off. 3 crazy tick-borne diseases, maybe a virus we don't know about, and Willy never let us know what that other thing was that he felt was the bioweapon. Is it sitting in a freezer somewhere in CDC? So epidemiologists, please run with this. Also, evolutionary biologists, we learned during the anthrax mailings that we could figure out, for the anthrax that was released in the post office, exactly what flask that came from genetically. So people need to ask Willy Burgdofer, which has a very mysterious evolutionary past, according to some microbiologists. Are there snippets of other diseases? Because we know Willy Burgdofer was helping with gain of function research, where you had a tick and you were putting multiple germs in it to make it extra confusing when it bit an enemy. So do we have valid samples in the gene bank for that disease, and can microbiologists and geneticists figure out what is inside this bug? And same with what's inside the ticks. And then I just wish public health would admit chronic Lyme really exists and start seriously looking at treatments. With a 30% treatment rate, I've reviewed the last 9 years of NIH grants, and we are spending less than 1% of our research budget on treatments for the people who are already sick. Why is that? Why?
Yeah, I had.
And then,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention that my former pastor in Mexico, they went back to the U.S. and they spent tens of thousands of dollars. I guess he had Lyme, and to treat it. And I don't know how he is lately, but I think he's better. But for a time, he was bedridden. So yeah, I mean, it's not something, I know someone who it's happened to. So it's affecting people.
Yeah, and everyone agrees the test is bad in the first month, and if the disease gets out of hand, you might not. It's really hard to treat it in later stages, and the cure is off-patent, safe antibiotics, and you don't need much in the beginning if you are proactive about treating. But instead, the medical society is afraid. I mean, everything about treatment off-label or without huge $1 billion randomized clinical trials, everyone's afraid to treat. And we need to say that the crushing chronic diseases in this country right now, so we're looking at long COVID, ME/CFS, that's chronic fatigue, Lyme disease, it is going to bring this country to its knees unless we get proactive of making people well instead of treating sick people's symptoms with blockbuster drugs every day. So that's sort of my soapbox rant. And that's why I've dedicated the last 20 years is to trying to get evidence to the front lines of medicine to say, this is a huge problem that you're denying. And insurance companies are denying it too. It's we don't want to pay for those expensive chronic diseases. So they're kicking the can down the road.
That's the economics of big pharma. Again,
Right.
people can get your book everywhere books are sold. BITTEN, I got the Kindle because I'm traveling around the world and it's hard to lug physical books with you. And I think that your website is krisnewby.com. I've signed up to your email list. Where are the best places to go online to find you and support your work?
KrisNewby.com, and then invisible.international is where I publish a lot of information on the science and the policy of
Invisible diseases. So mostly we're focusing on tick-borne diseases and Bartonellosis, which is a bacteria spread by, it's called cat scratch disease. Commonly it's spread by flea bites, cat bites, rose thorns. I mean, you can get it a lot of different ways, but it's a stealth pathogen that can give you neuropsych issues and come across as bipolar or depression or schizophrenia. So and then we're focusing on One Health. So trying to bring vets together with humans, people, because a lot of times these diseases spread in families, especially with imported pets during COVID. A lot of foreign diseases are being brought to unnatural places where there isn't protective immunity. So that is a good source. And then my foundation offers 30 plus continuing medical education courses that patients can take for free also. So that's useful if you think you have a disease and you want to learn more about it.
I'll include the links in the description. What is One Health, though?
Okay, One Health, it's sort of like a buzzword that's adopted by WHO and CDC, but it's not just looking at one germ and one disease in humans. It's saying if you have a sick ecosystem, animals are going to get sick, people are going to get sick, plants are. So it's just working together. All those scientists are in silos now and trying to get them to work together. A lot of times, animals around us get sick first, and we're actually better at tracking the animal health than human health, which is problems with CDC. And we've seen that with tracking COVID and Lyme disease. So it's about how, getting these people to work together so we can be better at curing all diseases for animals and people.
All right. Well, again, I recommend the book. Links will be in the description. Thank you for your research, your work, and thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Yeah, thanks for letting me talk about things I'm most passionate about.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.